So again, welcome. This is Making Buildings and Windows Bird Friendly. We are Denver Audubon hosting this program today. We are an independent chapter of the National Audubon. Since we are independent, that means we do all of our own programming. We don't necessarily follow exactly the programs that National Audubon might do, although we certainly support everything they do and use those programs as needed. We also do all of our own local fundraising. So if you give to National Audubon, we really appreciate that. We do get a few pennies or dollars of that membership. If you would like for your dollars to go locally, then Denver Audubon, you can give to us directly. You can also give to Audubon Rockies, which is a regional chapter, and that goes to a 3-state area. We are here to inspire actions that are going to help the birds. And today the actions that we are looking at has to do with bird window strikes, which is one of the top reasons for bird mortality. So our program, we do have a lot of different programs that we do in the metro area, locally here in the Denver metro area, and we could not do those without all of our volunteers. And we have a couple of volunteers joining us today. I want to thank Julia for helping with attendance today. And thank you again for those of you who put your attendance into the chat room. Again, questions, you can type them into the chat feature and I will share those as appropriate. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to our first speaker, who is Alex Halverson. He is former Lights Out administrator, former Lights Out Denver administrator, and he is going to be sharing some information on how we can make our buildings and windows bird friendly. Go ahead, Alex. Thanks for joining us.
Definitely, and thanks for having me, Susie, and thanks for everybody in the Audubon or Denver Audubon for having me, and for having Julia as well. We really appreciate being able to get our message out, not just about this program, but about bird collisions in general. And I know that's something our second speaker, Bryan Lenz, will be happy, shares that message as well. So let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, and let me know if there's any technical glitches that happen. Internet's known for going out at really inopportune times. So by all means, feel free to let me know. And I have been told that I have a pretty thick Midwest accent, so I apologize if you're not accustomed to that. You're going to be, there's a couple of us who have speaking today who have quite thick Wisconsin accents. So, yeah. So Susie had introduced me. I'm Alex Halverson, and today's presentation is really centered around the pretext of Lights Out Denver and its early stages. We just finished up our 3rd season, so we're in our now 3rd year as well. We're about to commence our 4th season of the project. So Lights Out Denver is the city's project focused on studying and mitigating bird collisions. And it's run by Denver Parks and Recreation, along with a team of volunteers and collaborating organizations, such as this one, such as Audubon. I was one of the 2 project administrators for this project, along with Vicky Vargas Madrid, who also joins us today, from its beginning until last November. I did so as an intern with Denver Parks and Rec, especially within their within the department's Natural Resources Division. I'm currently a master's student at CU Boulder, getting a master's in environmental studies and an MBA. My background's in conservation biology, but I am new to the birding scene. And birding is a newfound hobby of mine. I'm happy to admit that. I'm kind of ashamed I wasn't a birder before, especially given my conservation background. But because of this project and because of the gentle prodding of members of this society, as well as one like Denver field ornithologists, it's really got me out in the field and really got me a new appreciation for birds. And I'm always happy to talk about them, especially in this context. So now I'm going to hand it off to Julia Clark, who you'll hear from throughout the presentation. She'll help answer some questions and has a few slides to present on at the end.
Hey everyone, my name is Julia Clark. I am the current coordinator for the Lights Out Denver program. and I work with Denver Parks and Recreation. I've been with the city for 3 years in the Natural Resources Division of Denver Parks. So I run the Lights Out Denver program, but I also do a lot of field work, doing vegetation and wildlife management throughout the natural areas that Denver Parks has in the city. And then we also spend a lot of time doing work in Denver's wonderful mountain park system. So that's just a little bit about my background. I'm excited to be here with you guys. And like Alex said, I'm going to jump in at the end of the presentation to talk a little bit about where the Lights Out Denver program is today and our upcoming monitoring season. And we'll be here to answer any questions you might have. So happy to be here, and back to you, Alex.
Thanks, Julia. And when I've given this presentation before, some of the ones I was the administrator, so I have to make sure cognitively that I don't use the word we. I just want to make sure that I'm separate from Lights Out Denver. I just want to make sure that that's clear. And like Susie had mentioned, if you have any questions at any time, feel free to pop those into the chat, and then those will be addressed as quickly as possible. There we go. So there will be 4 general topics that we'll be covering today, or that I'll be covering. I'll be starting the presentation by giving a brief overview of anthropogenic sources of bird mortality. And that topic alone can't be covered in just one presentation. Each one of us, between Julia and Bryan and myself, and I'm sure a lot of you, could talk about birds on end for hours and hours and hours. Unfortunately, we only have 45, 50 minutes to do so. So I'll do my best to condense as much of this topic into that 45 minutes as possible. I'll do my best to provide a thorough overview to help you understand why Lights Out Denver and projects like it are in existence. I'm guessing that bird collisions is a topic that many of us are knowledgeable about, but I still hope that I can provide at least one tidbit of knowledge that you didn't have before. I'll then go on to briefly touch on one specific mitigation tactic to prevent bird collisions, but I'll leave much of that to Bryan Lenz, who will be presenting second. That'll be followed by a report on some current bird-friendly legislation, which seems to come out every single day. New legislation seems to come out every single day, especially that passed on municipal, state, and federal level. And I want to touch on that because for Lights Out Denver, it's important to know what has been passed already and how that legislation could impact the project, and more importantly, how it could impact birds. It's also very encouraging to see how prominent this topic is becoming in academic research and legislation and everyday discourse amongst birders and non-birders alike. Lastly, I'll go into detail about the foundation of Lights Out Denver, its progress so far, and then between Julie and I, we'll talk about its plans heading forward and how folks such as yourself can get involved. Okay. In an iconic study published in 2019, so just a year and a half ago, in the journal Science, the authors found that North America has experienced a net loss of about 3 billion birds since 1970. Those 3 billion birds represent about 1/3 of all birds that we have here in just 5 decades. There are several factors that have played into that, but at the root of it all are human actions and human processes. And when we think of human-caused bird deaths, I'll guess that many people, us in this room included, think of first of cats and then collisions with buildings. And I know a lot of resources from organizations like Audubon are spent on addressing that cat issue. And trust me, we'd love to spend as much time, as much resources eradicating the threat that cats pose to birds. But it's not necessarily feasible for a lot of issues. First, cats are property or considered family, and public policy isn't willing to wade into regulation of that. That's a really thorny issue. Second, cats have an emotional attachment to people and vice versa. And methods of reducing cat predation on birds are likely to be lethal, which would understandably receive a lot of backlash. And we aren't wrong in thinking that buildings and cats first when it comes to bird mortality. But unfortunately, windows and cats aren't the only anthropogenic threats to birds. This table lists estimates of the highest sources of mortality in the US. After glancing through the table, you'll realize that our cities and structures are not friendly at all to birds. Each year in the US alone, not North America, just in the US, more than 3 billion birds perish from these anthropogenic sources. Granted, these are estimates, but the enormity of the fatalities are still alarming. And by far the biggest source of mortality are cats, both domestic and feral. The top line in the table, collisions with building glass, is a scope of which Lights Out Denver and similar programs across the US and Canada work. Lights Out Denver aims to reduce bird collisions with buildings, and we would love to reduce all sources of anthropogenic mortality, but we just aren't able to address all of them at once, and nor some of them ever. Like I said, a cat issue. There are 2 hazards on here that haven't been addressed or that haven't been included on this list, but I still think are worth addressing. Those being habitat loss and artificial nighttime lighting. Both of these undoubtedly kill birds or lead to mortality, both indirectly and directly. My assumption is that bird mortality via habitat loss is extremely difficult to quantify, and that it's associated with some of these other hazards, such as building collisions due to urban sprawl. However, research is increasing into the effects of nighttime lighting on birds. Birds often confuse artificial lights for celestial cues and have been observed circling skyward facing light until exhaustion overcomes them. The most notorious example, unfortunately, of birds encircling lights is the 9/11 memorial in New York City. On 9/11 each year, 2 beams of light are shot up from where the Twin Towers once stood. But unfortunately, this display endangers hundreds of thousands of birds, about 160,000 birds, each time they're lit up. You can see in the photo on the left, the birds and the lights. Each one of those specks is a bird. Fortunately, to work together with the memorial, New York City Audubon has a team of volunteers monitoring it each year. And when a lot of birds start encircling the light, these volunteers will notify groundskeepers who then turn off the lights, allowing the birds to reorient themselves. Artificial nighttime lighting inside or outside of buildings is also believed to significantly induce window collisions, primarily with glass. Now I want to discuss the reasons why programs like Lights Out Denver exist in the first place. We now have an understanding of some of the sources of anthropogenic mortality, especially cats and collisions with buildings and structures. And that last one is what we'll be focusing on pretty much here on out. Estimates vary quite widely on the number that collide each year, the number of birds that collide with buildings each year. And we'll likely never know the exact number because of the difficulty in recording every single one. But no matter the range and upper and lower bounds of the estimates, the fact remains that hundreds of millions of birds at least collide with glass each and every year. And the majority of these collisions are lethal. You'd think by now that birds would have learned to avoid glass. Our cities have been around for a while, yet they still continue to collide with glass and other structures, but they often can't. And you might ask, how come? Like, why is it that they can't avoid glass? Well, for one, they can't see it. They can't differentiate glass like you and I might be able to. And so what we see as a door or a glass door or a window or an entire facade of windows, they see as potentially as a cavernous opening that looks either that they fly to or there's something on the other side of that glass that entices them. Secondly, with their eyes being on the sides of their head, they don't see directly ahead of them as well as we might do. Many species will probably see better than I do straight ahead because I'm pretty blind, but most people, they can see better than birds straight ahead. Many species also are most active at night, especially during the migratory season, and lit up structures are tempting or confounding, especially with a lot of glass nearby. Also, our cities are directly in the flyways. A lot of our major cities are in the middle of important flyways. And while our cities have been around for a long time, 100 years, 200 years, that doesn't mean that they're easy to navigate or easy to get through. Here in Denver, we're on the Central Flyway, where many big cities are also located, like Houston, Dallas, Vegas, Phoenix, and Salt Lake City. Our cities not only have eliminated large swaths of available habitat or historical habitat, we've imposed a grid of illuminated and shimmering obstacles for them. We don't make it easy for them to get out of our cities. Studies have shown that they're increasing their use of cities as migratory stopover habitat in lieu of more suitable forested, vegetated habitat. And that makes sense since our cities continue to build and continue to expand, especially here in Denver. But it is alarming as this can significantly reduce their chances of migration success. And you already saw the answer to that. But this begs the question, are all buildings bad? Are all buildings bird killers? The answer simply is no, not all of them are. Not all of them are death traps. And not all of them kill birds or cause collisions on a high scale or with the same frequency. But many are, at least to some extent. And we'll get into, in the next couple of slides, what buildings tend to cause the most collisions. These three photos highlight the types of buildings that are the worst offenders. Brightly lit buildings often attract birds, like we mentioned in the last slide, especially at night. Add to that the fact that birds can't detect glass, and you have double trouble. Right? You have a lot of light and glass. It's really, really difficult for birds. The Denver Convention Center, pictured here on the bottom left, you can see the big blue bear peeking in. It provides such an example of a well-lit building at night. And as you can tell, that's a north-facing side right there on, I think that's 14th Street. We have found a lot of birds there, and it's all glass. That facade right there is all glass. And on top of that, there's a lot of vegetation right in front of the windows as well. And if you've been anywhere in downtown Denver or the tech center, or pretty much anywhere in Denver, or areas with a lot of new development, which again describes all of Denver, you've probably noticed all of the new buildings being built, both residential and commercial. Many of these buildings are laden with glass, and that's because architects love glass. While glass is aesthetically and architecturally pleasing to many, they often pose a huge threat to birds, and by now we know that. Look at this photo of one of the Hiltons downtown Denver, the photo right there on the top. If you were a bird, would you have any clue what was going on here? You just see your reflection, you see the reflection of buildings, reflection of the sky. You don't necessarily know that that's glass. And the whole thing is glass. And when you put several of these buildings next to each other and several more on the same block and dozens of these blocks in downtown Denver or the tech center, and then dozens of these tech centers or dozens of these downtowns across the country, across the continent, across the world, you can understand how treacherous our cities can be for birds. And lots of these buildings have greenery or water features inside their lobbies or immediately outside the buildings, which I've mentioned now half a dozen times, those attract birds. Buildings that are close to bodies of water or swaths of greenery are perilous as well. Obviously, the picture on the right there of that building is not from Denver because I don't think there's a body of water that big, saying that facetiously in Denver. And while Denver is not necessarily near any large bodies of water like that, we do have the Platte River, the Bear Creek, and the Cherry Creek, and some of their tributaries. And they all provide great habitat for birds. My favorite birding spot is the Bear Creek, Greenway. A lot of birds there. And when development abuts these bodies of water, which will soon be happening in abundance along the Platte River, more and more birds will be colliding with the buildings unless they are designed with bird-friendly features. Examples of these features will be discussed later by Bryan, but I just want to bring that to your attention, now. And it's also important to point out that studies have found that over 90% of all bird window collisions occur within the first 3 floors of a building. So many people at first want to focus on the high-rise apartments or the skyscrapers like Empire State, or a 50-story hotel building downtown Denver. But it's really the first 30 feet or so that cause the vast majority of these collisions. And it's true of both residential and commercial buildings. Your house can induce collisions with birds, just like the convention center can, just like this tall building here on the right can. Okay? And that includes your home, your condo, or your office, or what used to be your office now that you're probably working from home. Like I've already mentioned, probably like you're already getting sick of me mentioning, birds collide often with houses and apartment complexes. However, it's worse than that. The train doesn't stop there. Birds collide with glass on any building and in any place. They often collide with boats, surprisingly, especially cruise ships. If you look at the newspaper heading from last year, you see that hundreds of birds were found on the deck of one single cruise ship. And that's just one boat and at one night. Imagine all the other cruise ships, all the other big boats, all the other yachts out there on the water, and you can understand the depth of this issue. Just one takeaway from my part of this presentation is that our cities suck for bird mortality. You know, they're not built with birds in them, and birds can collide with any glass surface on any type of building, as you're about to see here. Unfortunately, sports stadiums are culprits frequently as well. US Bank Stadium in Minneapolis, which is home of my favorite football team, I'm a diehard Vikings fan. That stadium is among the worst for collisions. Its facades are predominantly all glass, as you can see here in this picture. And when this design was chosen in 2012 or 2013, I can't remember the exact year, conservation organizations, especially the Audubon of the Twin Cities, wanted changes to be made because they knew what it would do to migrating birds. And the Twin Cities and Minnesota in general sits in the middle of a very, very important flyway. Unfortunately, those changes were never made, and the Stadium Authority continues to fight conservationists on that issue. And it continues to kill birds by the dozens each and every year. I'm sure that's not the only stadium, but it's probably the biggest culprit. We can go watch, have a beer and watch a losing football team play on Sunday, and then walk outside and see a whole bunch of dead birds. And it's not hard to see why. The thing is, that stadium is entirely glass. It's aesthetically pleasing. It's a pretty stadium, but it's all glass. It's a bird killer. And on top of that, it's very, very close to the Mississippi River. So lots of birds are flying through and around there. And on the other end of the spectrum is the Pfizer Forum in Milwaukee, which is ironically enough home of my favorite basketball team. So I'm kind of caught in the middle here. On one end, my favorite football team, their stadium is a death trap for birds. On the other end, my favorite basketball team, their stadium is a haven for birds, so to speak. The stadium was finished in 2019, so it's a brand new stadium. Its architects consulted with American Bird Conservancy, of which Bryan was a part of, and incorporated several bird-friendly designs. And it's now lauded as a success of bird-friendly construction. It is the first bird-friendly arena in the world, which is pretty cool. I didn't know that such a standard existed. And the fact that it's in my hometown makes it even more special for me. And I believe that the stadium, even though it's bird-friendly, hasn't lost any aesthetic or architectural appeal. So now that we're done talking about some of the anthropogenic bird mortality in the US and its severity, I'll be moving on to talking about one specific mitigation technique. The rest I'll leave to Bryan, especially with what people can do at their homes and their buildings to prevent bird collisions. Biggest thing, or one big thing that people can do, is reduce or eliminate artificial nighttime lighting associated with their homes, their offices, or their buildings, especially during the migration period, which is about to start here in mass here shortly. Turning off porch lights, moonlighting, or indoor lights at night, again, especially during migrations, can help reduce collisions with your home or your building or your office or any sort of structure. People can ensure the lighting fixtures on their homes or buildings are fully shielded to prevent light from being directed towards the sky. This is more of an issue with commercial buildings than it is with houses, but it is an issue nonetheless. In a similar vein, people can install motion activated lighting that is triggered only by humans or large animals such as Sasquatch, so lights don't remain on all night. So having those lights that are only triggered by movement, especially by large animals, can really help make a difference. The emphasis of reducing nighttime lighting is where programs such as Lights Out Denver get their name from. Future phases of Lights Out Denver will consist of working with downtown area business and building owners to address their windows and lighting regimes, especially. Reducing nighttime lighting not only benefits birds, but it reduces light pollution and reduces energy usage and costs. So it's a win-win for everybody. This is the proposition, the rare conservation proposition that benefits a lot of people, that benefits all or most stakeholders. Later phases of the project, or hopefully the city's government, Denver's city's government, passes bird-friendly legislation, can address another area of bird collisions, and that being architectural design. Preventing U.S. Bank stadiums in Minneapolis from being designed in that specific way, and trying to build stadiums and buildings in line more with the Pfizer forums in Milwaukee. This issue of architectural designs and legislation specifically has been getting a lot of traction in recent years and has received positive feedback from both architects and building owners. Architects, general contractors, building designers, they don't want their buildings to kill birds. They don't have a vendetta against birds. And so working with them to come up with ways that their building can be designed to be bird friendly is a win-win for a lot of people. It's easier to implement bird friendly designs into the blueprint of the building, and it's cheaper to do that as well than it is to retrofit a building. Think of any building you can think of that has a lot of glass. It's easier to incorporate bird-friendly glass into the blueprint, into the construction, than it is to take out all that window on the first 3 floors and retrofit it with bird-friendly glass. And that's a big goal of a lot of these cities and a lot of these lights out-esque projects is to get new buildings to kind of follow this bird-friendly code. I'm now going to move on to maybe the more dry part of the lecture, which is legislation. It's not for everybody. It wasn't for me until recently, until I started taking policy classes at CU and learned just honestly how fascinating policy can be. I guess that's my nerd moment for the day. And so another method of preventing bird collisions is through this legislation. And that is the focus of this next section, which will undoubtedly probably be the longer section, or the more long-winded section of this presentation. I want to touch on that, not because I want to bore you, but because for Lights Out Denver, it's important to know what has been passed already and how that legislation could impact the project, and more importantly, how that can impact birds. Again, this is all for the birds. It's also very encouraging to see how prominent this topic, bird-friendly legislation, is becoming in academic research, legislation across the country on all different levels, and in everyday discourse like this. We're able to talk about it. Granted, this is a bird enthusiast group, but I'm sure a lot of you or those who have talked to you about this have talked to others about this topic as well. I'll then lastly go into detail about the foundation of Lights Out Denver, its progress, and where the current team plans on taking the project. And that'll be mainly spearheaded by Julia Clark. And like I mentioned last slide, this topic of bird collisions is really starting to garner a lot of momentum, both nationally and internationally. There's a growing amount of legislation that either directly or indirectly requires bird-friendly measures of buildings. Further than that, groups like Audubon are spreading awareness of the issue, which has helped quite a bit in gaining attention from a wider audience, from a more layperson audience. It seems that weekly or daily now, there are new mandates, laws, or policies proposed. And I'd love to talk with you about each one of those, the ones that I know about. But I feel like if I did talk about every single one of those, I'd be talking to myself by the end of it, because you'd all be logged off. I'd probably lose you all. So I'll only highlight one or two of them for each level of government, because I think that still provides a pretty good backdrop, a pretty good understanding of some of the legislative policies out there. So some of the local examples. In December 2019 seems to be a pretty seminal year for bird conservation. I'm not sure why, but a lot of things happened with bird conservation in 2019. And that year, New York City passed a bill that requires new construction and major renovations to install materials that are visible to birds, such as dotted patterns, tints, or glazing on glass and windows. Specifically, the bill requires that at least 90% of the exterior of a building's first 75 feet be constructed with bird-friendly materials. So they went above and beyond the 30-foot requirement, and they extended that bird-friendly requirement up to 75 feet. And as you can imagine, there's quite a few buildings in New York City that are 75 feet. It's huge that New York City passed this. It is the biggest city in the country, one of the biggest on the entire continent. And it gives every other city in the country, Denver included, hope that similar legislation can be passed in their city. Other cities have passed similar resolutions. A lot of cities have. I've just realized recently that my hometown of Wauwatosa, Wisconsin, is in the works to pass something. Other cities in Wisconsin are looking to do the same thing or have done it. But other notable examples include San Francisco and Oakland in California. Universities are even passing resolutions to make their buildings more bird friendly. So I'm a little biased towards my hometown and affiliations, but my alma mater, the University of Minnesota, just passed a student-led resolution to make their buildings more bird friendly back in 2019. And Stony Brook University in New York and Long Island recently did as well last year. It's often easier to focus resources for passing legislation on the local level because of unique cultural and political conditions within each locality, like Denver. There's varied ecosystems, both built and natural, within each state, and because of centralized efforts that are common within a locality, like Lights Out Denver, but might vary or be non-existent across other localities within a state. As of this moment, Lights Out Denver is the only formalized lights out type of project in the state of Colorado. Others, especially on campuses, the Auraria campus here downtown Denver, Fort Collins, the CSU campus up there, both of those are pretty involved with it, but nothing formalized to the extent that Lights Out Denver is. However, this lack of statewide cohesion hasn't stopped a few states from either introducing or passing bird-friendly legislation. The state of Maryland recently passed their Sustainable Buildings Act that requires state buildings, so state-owned and operated buildings, to minimize adverse impacts on birds. A vague statement and a very, very, very small subset of the state's building repertoire, but it's a start. Further, the state of Ohio has the Ohio Bird Conservation Initiative, which is a collective or collaborative mission between government, businesses, and nonprofit organizations that unites the state's major cities, Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati, in an effort to make them more bird friendly and to promote bird friendly legislation. So now here is where I feel like I'm going to lose a few people, so I apologize with a little bit of the dryness of this part, but what I'm about to talk about, especially with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, is extremely relevant to news that happened just this week. So the federal government has had several legal opinions of birds and bird conservation over the years. For example, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, like I just mentioned, passed in 1918. It has been extremely beneficial in bird conservation. but has been really limited in recent years by legal decisions by the federal government. The previous administration, again, no, I'm not getting political here, just stating facts, but the previous administration hampered the efficacy of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which has been instrumental in conserving birds and their habitat for over 100 years. The current administration has publicly stated their interest in reversing some of the detrimental undoings of the act. And actually in the last 48 hours on Monday, that administration followed through. I found this out last night while I was scrolling through Facebook. I actually had to update the slide earlier this morning. That right there kind of shows the evidence of the growing momentum that bird safety, bird friendly measures are garnering in our society and around the world. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act, for most of its history, has made both intentional and incidental take of birds illegal. Incidental take is often associated with bird collisions, like we've been talking about, wind turbines, and industrial processes that endanger birds. Think of that table from a few slides ago. Those, for the most part, all the examples of incidental take. However, last year, Trump's administration initiated an opinion of the act that would reduce its ability to persecute for incidental take. And that right there was favorable to industry, especially the energy sector. And his administration passed a law mandating the same thing, because that opinion was actually rejected by federal court. But his waning days in office, his administration passed a law that essentially did the same thing. However, on Monday, the Interior Department rescinded that opinion and will soon propose a rule to replace that law by the previous administration. So on Monday, that opinion was overruled, and essentially they're going to do everything they can to make sure that incidental take is illegal as well, which would do a lot for bird conservation. And that's kind of why I have question marks next to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. It's kind of been used as a pawn between successive, administrations throughout the years in our country. Similarly, the Endangered Species Act has largely followed that same act, or that same path, but on a much more broad scale, because it encompasses all species, not just birds. A famous success story, as a lot of us are probably aware of the Endangered Species Act, is the bald eagle, which was on the doorstep of extinction just 50 to 60 years ago, but has since recovered quite considerably. So the fact that you go to the Rocky Mountain Arsenal down the road and you're bound to see at least one or two. I've seen a few flying to the airport, flying next to the airport, which is pretty cool. However, other species that go on that list, other bird species that go on that list, have never come off. Or if species do come off, there's a lot of legal battles going on with them. An example of that would be grizzly bears and would be wolves. In terms of recent federal legislation, there's a paragraph in the Department of the Interior's most recent budget. Yes, I've read the Department of the Interior's most recent budget. I don't suggest doing it, and I suggest doing it before you go to bed, because it will put you to sleep. But there's a paragraph within that budget that mandates that all agencies under the Department of the Interior, which includes the National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, and the Fish and Wildlife Service, among others, to implement a monitoring program for the buildings and to take low or no cost actions to reduce bird collisions. Again, somewhat vague. Again, small, really, really small subset of overall buildings and the inventory of buildings. But it is a step towards progress nonetheless, and we'll take it. So bit by bit, we are working towards reducing bird collisions on our campuses, in our cities, our states, and our public lands. It will require continued action and increased support from all citizens, ranging from the birding community like us, all the way up to Fortune 500 companies and CEOs. But I feel that we are gaining momentum, which is a bit of positive that we could all use right now, especially considering that we're supposed to get feet of snow this weekend. And Lights Out Denver hopes to capitalize on that momentum to get bird-friendly legislation passed here in Denver. We really hope that we can continue that momentum both nationally, but also here extremely locally in order to get some of these new buildings to incorporate bird-friendly designs. So now that I've talked about bird mortality, I've talked about mitigation, one mitigation technique, and I've slogged through the legislation with current bird-friendly designs. We'll now be diving into Lights Out Denver specifically, and what Lights Out Denver is and what they do, and how we address the issue, not just of bird conservation, but more specifically, bird collisions here in our city. Project's roots start 7 years ago in 2014, when Denver was first designated as an urban bird treaty city. And the Urban Bird Treaty City is a program through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it's an initiative between the Fish and Wildlife Service and participating cities like Denver or Albuquerque, New Mexico. It brings together government agencies like Denver Parks and Rec, nonprofits, and academic institutions to create bird-friendly environments and to provide cities or citizens, especially youth, with opportunities to connect with nature through birding and conservation. So that's a definition taken directly from the program's website. Each designated city is tasked with conserving bird or urban habitats for birds, reducing urban hazards for birds, hence the emphasis on reducing bird collisions with buildings. And third, educating and engaging the community about birds and bird conservation. And that education part and community engagement part is a really underrated part of conservation projects across the world, but in particular, with bird conservation. There's a huge base of birders around the world. And you start spreading this message to them, it's really going to start gaining traction that much more traction. In 2014, when Denver was first designated by this program, one of the city's goals was to implement a lights out type of project. Shortly after, one was started by the Office of Sustainability within City and County of Denver, but it didn't have much success getting off the ground. But the idea for a lights out project was on their mind, but relatively dormant, and no actions were taken to restart the program until 2018. And this is a map of all of the urban bird treaty cities here in the United States. The member cities range in geography, ecoclimes, and size quite a bit. There are some major cities like Minneapolis and St. Paul, Houston, Detroit, Denver, Chicago, Baltimore, Phoenix, New York City, and Atlanta. So some pretty major cities. But then there are also smaller cities like Kennedale, Texas, Lewiston, Montana, New Haven, Connecticut, and Opelika, Alabama. Not all of these urban bird treaty cities have programs like Lights Out, but many of them do. They might not call it Lights Out Atlanta, but the goal of the project is pretty similar. Reducing hazards to birds as one of the major goals of the Urban Bird Treaty Program has been a big emphasis of these projects. These projects that are aimed at reducing urban bird collisions owe a lot to the city of Toronto, Canada, or Toronto, Ontario. This is where that was the first project. It's called Fatal Light Awareness Program, or FLAP for short. It started in the mid-1990s, and since then, dozens of cities have adopted similar programs all across Canada and the United States. I'm not as familiar with the Mexico side of these programs, but I'm sure there are similar programs in Mexico. Each of these programs consists of data collection on bird collisions within the cities, within the municipalities. And that data is then used to understand basic ecological trends, such as collision totals, vulnerability by species, collisions by building, and then seasonal migration trends, such as when migration starts and ends. And as the climate continues to shift, we are starting to see shifts in the migration periods a little bit. Further, Each program tries to work with business and building owners, as well as other local stakeholders to reduce bird collisions on a building by building basis, going to the building owner, going to the business manager, and asking them to voluntarily take part in that program. Typically, this is achieved through reducing nighttime lighting. So those individual buildings will reduce the nighttime lighting to be part of this program. But it has also been achieved with window retrofits or the reduction or new placement of inside greenery and water features. Lights Out Denver is largely based on and heavily influenced by these other projects. We consulted extensively with administration from projects in Baltimore, state of Michigan, Chicago, Ohio, and New York. We have lent support and advice to fledgling programs in other cities. And there we go, again, saying we. So I apologize for saying we. Lights Out Denver has done all those things. The project has also learned a great deal from Bryan and from Chris Shepard of the American Bird Conservancy. And these projects all collaborate with each other, borrow ideas from each other, share data with each other, and share goals and objectives with each other. And although each project is its own entity, as a network across the country and continent, these projects work together to reduce bird collisions. They all root for success in each other's cities. The way in which Lights Out Denver is slightly different than these organizations is that it is operated by a government agency, Denver Parks and Recreation, while the others, like Lights Out Baltimore, are mainly run as nonprofit organizations. And I do have to admit, the logo and the social media presence and websites are works in progress. They will be coming at some point in the future. But most importantly, we have started the project. We've started the project and are continuing to follow through with it. The project has been separated into 3 distinct phases. The project's currently in phase 1. The project's currently in phase 1. This past fall was the project's 3rd season, and they're gearing up now for the 4th field season. They have 2 routes that are walked by teams of 2 volunteers, at least 2 volunteers. That's mainly for safety precautions during the season, where their volunteers record data on any collision they encounter. The routes that they walk are between Broadway and Arapahoe downtown, divided between 14th through 16th Street, and then 17th through 19th Street. Vicki and I identified these as areas of downtown with high densities of candidate buildings with a lot of glass. We acknowledge that there are other areas with high densities of glass buildings, such as the Union Station area or the Tech Center, but we have remained focused on getting the project off the ground and on steady footing before the project expands. Any deceased birds, depending on the state of the specimen, are then taken to the Denver Museum of Nature and Sciences Ornithology Collection. Conversely, any live specimen are handled according to the proper handling techniques and then taken along with the volunteer for the duration of the route. If at the end of the route is unable to fly, if it is able to fly, it's then released. If it is still stunned or has sustained bodily damage, it is then transported to either Wild Bird Rehab Center or to Greenwood Wildlife Rehab Center in Longmont for treatment. Lights Out Denver wants data on bird collisions, including the building and the address of that building and the frequency. So then this data can then be brought to stakeholders in phases 2 and 3 of the project. In phase 2, the goal is to engage and approach the downtown business community. The goal is to have the building owner and business owner community abide by the bird-friendly guidelines by turning off their lights, especially during the migratory season. But ideally, they do that year-round. And like I mentioned several slides earlier, it's a win-win proposition for a lot of people. The building reduces energy costs. They can communicate through marketing or other means that they are more green focused and sustainability focused. Whether or not you might see that as greenwashing, they can still use that as a marketing opportunity. And then birds, we can then help birds by reducing some of the hazards that they face. In phase 3, the Lights Out Denver hopes to work with city legislators to pass bird-friendly legislation here in Denver. And that is one of the things that the administration of Lights Out Denver has seen as an advantage of being housed in the government, is that they rub elbows quite a bit with people who can help with this, with city legislators. And so they see that as quite a bit of an advantage over some of these other projects that are operated out of a nonprofit and have to forge those relationships with local policymakers. And then this is a list of the project's partners and collaborators. I do want to mention that Colorado Parks and Wildlife also contributes to the project. Every specimen that goes to the Denver Museum of Nature and Science is tagged so that long-term data can be taken directly from the project. Project is always looking for new collaborators and partners. They've been exploring ways to get the Denver Zoo involved in the project, and for Lights Out Denver to have a hand in making the zoo more bird friendly. I always say that the project presents, and any project like Lights Out Denver presents, a catch-22 of sorts. If the project is to be successful and long running and collect a lot of data and get bird friendly legislation passed, it means that that the project will have collected a lot of data on injured or deceased birds. On the other hand, no one wants to find, anyone with a conservation bent doesn't want to find a lot of dead birds, because that means our city is pretty deadly for birds. But we're also hesitant to say that we don't want any. And so we've said that the ones that we do find hopefully have died for a cause, so that one day we can prevent birds from colliding with the buildings. So far, we have, like I said, we've been through 3 seasons now, about to ramp up the 4th. 45 specimens have been recorded and are collected. So we have a total of 45 data points. There have been 21 species positively identified or correctly identified. There have been 5 unknown species, and that could be mainly due to the pretty deteriorated state of the deceased bird. There might have been a few times where I've had to ask for help because of my amateur birding level on bird ID skills. Of those 45, 8 were alive and 37 were deceased. And that's typically what a lot of these projects find, is that the vast majority of the specimens are deceased. We have had a great team. The project has had a great team of volunteers over the first 3 seasons. The first season, we had over 30 volunteers help us collect data. Due to COVID protocols, they've had to dwindle that quite a bit. But the volunteers that help are extremely dedicated and extremely helpful. There are other ways volunteers can get involved, such as spreading the word about Lights Out Denver, so marketing, helping to analyze the data, which they could always use help with, identifying birds that they are unable to, which again, like I said, I was not always the best at it. I had to refer to our ornithology guy at the museum quite a bit. There are 2 last slides I have for you all before we hand it off to Julia. And these 2 slides highlight the most problematic buildings that they found along the route. The Denver City Center, you can see that at the point that's been highlighted on this map, right there. It's located between 17th and between Stout, or it's on 17th between Stout and California. It's been the scene of 12 of the 45 data points, so quite a bit. It's been more than 1/4 of them. It has a beautiful courtyard with a lovely garden, which is a great place to have lunch. But that's where most of the birds have been found. Actually, our very first bird was found in that courtyard. There are buildings on two sides of the courtyard, and both unfortunately have a lot of glass, especially that one on the right there. So it's great for attracting birds and watching birds while you're eating a snack or having coffee, but it's extremely treacherous for those birds when they want to fly out. Similarly, we have another troublesome building on the corner of 19th and Broadway. It's kind of a funky looking building. Again, it has a nice little courtyard situated between a church and the building, but as well, it's a death trap for birds. I want to emphasize too that we are not trying to work against these buildings. We're not trying to slander these buildings or any buildings that we notice cause bird collisions, but rather work with them as mutual interested parties, because we want our city, we want them to be more bird friendly. And that's something that a lot of people can get behind. But it's important to carry that message with you, whether you're a volunteer, whether you're an administrator, or whether you're just somebody who's knowledgeable about the subject. The building owners likely weren't the ones who built the buildings, but they are the ones who can kind of implement some of these bird-friendly measures. And so coming to them with mutual interest instead of slander is always extremely helpful. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Julia. So she'll take over for the last few slides to talk about the upcoming schedule and itinerary and goals of the project.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. And thank you for giving that great background about all the work you did for Lights Out Denver and how we really got this program started in the last few years. I just want to talk briefly about kind of where the program is today and where we're hoping to take it in the future and some areas we're going to focus on in 2021. And so again, really our main focus is still on collecting data, and we have started to build up that data set, but we just really want to keep adding to it. So we have some really compelling evidence to bring to the table when we are trying to advocate for bird-friendly lighting practices and bird-friendly building designs. But we're also looking at ways that we can try to broaden our reach and have more opportunities for community involvement. So we've made some changes to how we are collecting data, just using online forms that could be shared kind of more widely than just with our volunteer base, so that maybe we could start slowly collecting data beyond the downtown area and just have more involvement with a wider audience. So it's still an evolving program, and we're figuring out new ways to map the data and share the data with our partners and with the public. And then, like Alex mentioned, even though it's still a young program, we already have started to see some trends in the data of buildings that are hotspots for collisions, and that would be really good candidates for some sort of intervention, such as turning their lights out to make them more bird friendly. So we'd love to start having those conversations this year. With COVID, it's made it harder to have that face-to-face kind of connection, but we are hoping to approach those building managers for those buildings that we have already kind of have some of that compelling data for. And then our last area of focus for 2021 is to expand our partnerships. Like Alex said, this program has benefited so much from our partners and the great collaborations we have, including with Denver Audubon. And we're always looking to strengthen those partnerships and to build new partnerships, including within the city government. And we've started to have conversations with folks in the Department of Community Development and Planning, as well as in the Office of Climate Action, Sustainability and Resilience. And so those are exciting connections to have within the city government, and we're excited to pursue those more this year. Next slide, please. So if you are interested in learning more about this program or joining us as a volunteer, we would love to have your help. We are getting really close to our 4th monitoring season. We're going to train, have a virtual training session for our volunteers on April 6th at 5:30 p.m. So just in a few weeks. And we're hoping to have volunteers monitor from April 12th to June 4th. And that window might change a little bit just based on the migration forecast and the weather forecast, but that's about the window that we're aiming for our spring migration monitoring. And so if you have questions or would like interested in volunteering or just want to learn more about the program, that's my email on the screen. I would love to hear from you. Feel free to reach out. But if anyone has any questions now, this is the end of Alex and I's talk. So we could take questions now if anyone has anything.
Thank you so much. Yes. First of all, Cynthia said that this was great, helpful information being presented so far. We do have a few questions specific to window treatments, which I'm going to hold off on right now, since Bryan will be addressing some of those questions and might answer those in his presentation. But one question specific to Lights Out Denver is have you thought about reaching out to architects and architectural schools? And also targeting key tenants and trying to get them to pressure building owners. The thought being, especially with the predicted softness of the commercial real estate market due to the shift to at-home workers, that might be an effective route. So can one of you address the architects, architectural schools, and tenants?
Yeah, so I think that that's a really exciting opportunity to build another route, another connection we can make, and another approach. I do think it is going to be very interesting to see what the impact of COVID and the work from home and kind of the reimagining of the downtown workplace might have, especially on building practices like nighttime lighting, which those buildings are usually not occupied at night, which is why we're hoping that the buildings would be willing to turn their lights off. So we have not pursued those connections yet, but now that we are starting to have this data set, that's something that we're hoping to be able to use to compel places to start thinking about this issue and to take it seriously once we can kind of show that this really is happening in our city.
Great, thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and move along to our presentation from Bryan Lenz, who is with the American Bird Conservancy. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Bryan.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay, good. I have two mute buttons, one on Zoom and one in my hand because I have little kids. So thank you for having me. Let's see if I can get this started. My name is Bryan Lenz. I am the Glass Collision Program Manager for American Bird Conservancy. I also am the Bird City Americas Director, and that is a program that we are launching hemisphere-wide. And Environment for the Americas, which is actually in Boulder, has created a Bird City, Colorado program. So that would be something that everybody in this talk could engage with and reach out to either Environment for the Americas or me. I do have a PhD, which I got studying primates in the Amazon, just as a little bit of background. So I've come a long way to birds, but I bird watched my way through all my field work. So I've ended up in a good spot for my interests. I also just want to mention quickly that ABC does a lot of different things on collisions. We train and teach architects. We give all kinds of collision talks. We do research on things from glass testing, which I'll show you just real briefly. We work on legislation and just do like pretty much the entire range of collision stuff. So I'm gonna, at the end of this, walk you through the brand new website we just launched so you can kind of take a look at what we have put out there for you to explore collisions further. I might talk a little fast. I'm a little worried. Normally this talk is an hour. So I deleted a bunch of stuff to make it fit in here. Alex covered this a little bit, but the drivers of bird mortality that are anthropogenic or human caused in the United States every year, collisions with glass are number 2 on the list, killing an estimated 599 million birds per year. That works out to 1.64 million birds each day. And if you started counting now and didn't stop, so no sleep, no work, no bird watching, it'd take you 19 years to count that high. This is a lot of birds. We also often say up to a billion because that estimate of 599 million had a range, and the study threw out the worst buildings. So they had some buildings that just killed a ton of birds, and they didn't want to be accused of trying to skew the average upward. So they tossed out the really bad buildings. Plus the monitoring data that a lot of this study was based on, was collected in, prior to 2010. And every single year people build new buildings that are shinier and have larger percentages of glass, and replace windows on existing buildings that are taking windows that probably weren't a problem and replacing them with windows that probably are a problem. So you may hear up to a billion, and even that itself may be a little bit conservative. Generally, there are two types of collisions people ask about when talking about glass. The first cause death and injury. They're those high-speed thuds that everybody here is here to learn more about. Territorial aggression also causes collisions, and that's what this cardinal here is doing. So birds in spring and in the breeding season will challenge their reflections in windows. Those don't happen at high speed, but are pretty annoying for the occupants of those rooms. So we get asked about those collisions too, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. So of the 599 million a year, which buildings are the worst? Alex mentioned this a little bit. Less than 1% of those collisions happen on buildings that are 12 stories or taller. 44% happen at 1 to 3 story buildings, which includes homes, but also includes a lot of non-homes. And then buildings that are 4 to 11 stories kill the largest chunk with 56% of this total. Now, this is good information because it tells us that if all we do is focus on the tall buildings downtown, we're not even going to make a 1% difference in the collision issue. However, those buildings are still really important because if you look at the number of birds killed per building, the 12 stories and above kill an average of 24 birds per year. The homes that 1 to 3 stories are a range of 2 to 10, and the low-rise buildings are 21 birds per year. So the high rise and the low rise are 24 and 21 birds a year. So it's really important to get those buildings, and some of them kill hundreds of birds a year. So you can have a larger impact by doing one of those than you can, but this is really just to say that we need an all hands on deck approach. We can't just focus on one building type or one building size and hope to really make a huge difference. So in looking at why collisions happen and what we can do to prevent them, the number one rule that underlies glass collisions is that the more glass you have, the more collisions you're going to have. This building, or this photo here, is a good illustration of what I mentioned earlier about building trends having changed over time. You know, in the middle right now, we build shiny buildings that are as much glass as you can get, which is what that Apple store is. If you look behind it on the left, you see a building probably from the 70s, which is about half glass, and that glass is pretty reflective. And then if you look in the back right, you see a building probably from the 40s or the 50s, which is probably a third glass maybe, and the glass is not reflective. And each piece of it is smaller. So I would expect those buildings to pose, you know, a per square foot kind of collision risk in that order. And our glass technology has improved over the years, so we can make bigger and bigger panes of glass. And now we have multiple panes of glass, which adds to the reflection. And then they add all these different coatings, which are designed to improve energy efficiency, but also make them more reflective and worse for birds, which is why changing the windows on your home and getting new replacement windows, you can have a house that almost never had a collision to one that has a bunch. By increasing the amount of glass, you also increase the energy inefficiency. So the kind of sweet spot for glass on a building, if you look at some of the general model buildings, is about 30%. And if you go under that, or if you start going way over that, the energy costs start skyrocketing. So an all glass building costs a lot more to operate than a building that's 30% glass. So you get higher bills for the tenants. You often hear people talk about, well, some of the bird friendly materials cost a little bit more, and that's not, we can't spend the money because we can't pass that along to our tenants and our residents and the occupants. However, they are passing along higher energy bills forever, which more than makes up for any incremental marginal costs that the appropriate building materials would have. If you're concerned about climate change too, the more energy you pump out of the building, the more CO2 we're putting into the atmosphere. And I don't remember the exact percentage, but I think the buildings in New York City are the largest single emitter of CO2. And it's like 40% of the city's CO2 emissions are just from building operation. So this really does add up. In general, there are three things we talk about for why birds hit windows and glass. It doesn't necessarily have to be glass either. If you've got highly polished metal, birds will hit that just the same. The first is that it's reflective. So it shows sky, trees, habitat, a flyway between buildings that are actually behind the bird. Just anything that it looks like the bird would find as an appealing flight path. The second is that the glass or the other material is clear. A good example of that are atria in large buildings in downtown. They often plant them with trees, which is nice if you're inside. But if you think about being one of those migrating birds that Alex and Julia talked about, coming down in the middle of the city after having flown 500 miles and being starving and not finding a lot of trees, the inside of that building looks pretty appealing to you. The third issue is lighting, which I'm not going to really talk much about here. I just will say that, it kind of operates in two ways: the beacon effect, which is the New York World Trade Center Memorial. The birds will, kind of get stuck in that light until you turn them off. But the bigger problem today, because if you look at the bottom right there, that's a picture of the city of Houston. There's a lot of light there. So trying to do the best we can to keep birds out of the city to begin with is important, but it's a really big battle. So we need everybody to get in on the lights out front. And the radar ornithology research, which basically looks at the weather radar that you're used to looking at on TV, and birds show up on that. So if you go to Operation Birdcast, you can actually see how heavy the migration is based on weather radar data. Those studies show that birds even concentrate along freeways that are lit going out of town, which is not a whole lot of light. So this really is something where we need everybody to do their part and shield and turn off as many lights as possible. It's also good to think about the fact that birds don't speak architecture. So, Alex mentioned it too, like, why haven't birds learned? I point out people don't learn. To shorten this talk, I cut out some really funny videos that showed that people don't see glass either. But on the upper left there, you can't tell me what that is. Are you looking directly at the trees in the sky, or is there something in the way? If you take a little bit of a step back, you start to see window frames there. So most people would go, oh, there's a window frame. I bet there's a window there. And then if you take another step back, you see, oh, actually, look, it's an entire building. The bird doesn't get any of that. So while we can learn the cues, like looking for a window frame, looking for a doorknob, looking for placement relative to other building or kind of walkway features, birds never, ever get that. A bird may learn about a single individual piece of glass, but then when it moves, it knows nothing about any other piece of glass. In terms of what some of the solutions are for collisions, it used to be that, if you put a hawk decal on your window, you were done. And the hawk decal actually wasn't a hawk. I think it was a kestrel. But, that was an attempt before people really systematically started looking at how we can prevent this problem. The only thing the hawk decal does is keep the bird from hitting the hawk decal. So unless you're going to put a whole bunch of them on your window, you can probably just skip it and go with something different. So ABC has a tunnel at the Powder Mill Nature Reserve in Pennsylvania where they have a bird banding operation. And we use that to test products to see how well birds can see them and react to them. We're in the process of building a second tunnel at Foreman's Branch Bird Observatory. And there is another researcher who has a similar tunnel in Europe. So in terms of how you enact solutions to this, there are really two options. One is you target new construction, including building ordinances, but not only ordinances. And the second is you work on retrofitting existing buildings. I'm going to talk more about number two than number one here, just because I think that is what most people will be interested in. But for new construction, the solutions are to incorporate it from the beginning. So if you use appropriate bird-friendly building materials and design techniques, you're done. You don't ever have to fix it. And those things include reducing the amount of glass and the exposure of it. So if you're using solar shading or any other thing that can be put between the bird and the glass, it will help. Putting signals in or on the glass, which we'll talk more about in a second. As Alex mentioned, focusing on the lower floors. I'm working on a research team to try and develop an artificial intelligence product that will allow us to see exactly how high up a bird's hit, so we know how high we need to go. And then when you're kind of pitching this, bird-friendly design over with a whole lot of things. Everything on the bottom of the list here, but a lot of these products that we talk about, architects already know what they are and know how to use them. So it's just a question of having them change the way they use some of the things they're already using. The solutions, as far as ordinance goes, the goal is to maximize the amount of bird-friendly glass. So if it's going to be glass, you want it to be bird-friendly. Again, reduce how much there is as much as possible. And it's also important to try and include renovations that replace glass. So, a lot of buildings, the windows get old and they fail and then they get leaky and people get tired of paying those huge energy costs. So they change the windows. A good example is the building on the right, which is the Jacob Javits Center in New York. That is an all glass building and they changed all of it and they put in a bird-friendly pattern. And as you might imagine, it was a huge bird killer before and the collisions dropped 95%. After they put in frit. And the picture right there has the bird-friendly glass in it, and you can't really tell. So it is not something that is noticeable. You don't have to turn a bird-friendly building into a concrete bunker to make it effective. As was mentioned, New York City passed legislation, which is now called Local Law 15, that it is in place. And it actually requires bird-friendly glass in every single building, whether it's a house in Brooklyn or a skyscraper in Manhattan. So this is a game changer. This is the most anybody has ever asked for and required as far as legislation. This is a quick list of legislation that is in place right now. I will show you real briefly on our website when I pop out of here a little bit more about this. So in terms of retrofitting a building, which would be relevant for the Denver Lights Out program and also for homes in any buildings where you live or work. At ABC, our goal is to fix the problem windows and leave the rest. So you could say, hey, I have a collision issue and just put a retrofit on every single window in your home or your workplace. And if you do that, let me know. And when COVID's over, I will come out there and give you a hug. That would be great. However, that's not really practical. And the bigger the building, the higher the expense of doing this. So our main goal is to fix the bad windows and leave the rest of them. So we have a number of steps here. The first one is to do lights out, especially if it's at your home. It's not that difficult. And it will save you some money. The second step is to pay attention. So you're monitoring, even if it's your house. And if you've ever heard a bird hit a window, you can put that window on your list because a bird will hit that one again. And once you have your list of, all right, well, I know birds have hit these windows and I just heard one hit that window, then you make a plan. You go through some of the things we're going to look at real quickly here in a moment, and pick a product, pick your solution, pick your action. Then you do it. You put it up, put it in place. The collision should stop or be greatly reduced. These products are not 100%. It's also important to point that out. And then you keep listening and paying attention and monitoring. And the next time you hear a bird hit a window, you put something on that one, and it won't be too long and you'll be done. And you'll have made a big difference because in a lot of buildings, collisions end up being concentrated in small areas. There's a note on the bottom, glass is more important than lighting. So if you're going to treat one thing and you have to pick, I mean, you never really have to pick this, but you do the glass before you do the lighting. The lighting is much easier and really makes perfect sense to do it. And there's not a whole lot of reason, as far as I'm concerned, not to do the lighting. But if for some reason you have to pick, you know, we talk about making sure the glass is bird friendly first. As far as, you know, being able to focus this is a project we have been doing with Northwestern University in Chicago. And these buildings are being monitored. And I requested that the monitors, we created sections for the buildings so we could assign parts of the buildings where the collisions are happening. And you can see the Allen Center in the middle, almost half of the collisions happen on a tiny percentage of the building. So on that building, you could do the 46% section, the 17% section, and then move over to spend the rest of your budget on the worst sections of some of these other buildings, rather than just doing that whole building and, you know, taking care of the 3% side. Ideally, all of it would be done, but, you know, in the real world, we have to set priorities. So in terms of some of the solutions for retrofitting buildings, a lot of these are designed for homes. I have a whole separate list of pictures and things like that for professionals buildings. One thing we talk about are interior, or excuse me, not interior, that's the opposite of what I want. Exterior insect and solar screens. So you can see the picture on the left. The left window has a screen on it and the right window doesn't. And the window on the left is bird friendly because there's almost no reflection on it anymore. And it darkens it up enough that it doesn't really look like an appealing flyway. You can see the window on the right too. On the bottom, there's actually 3 lines of black tape. They're horizontal on the bottom. And that's there to illustrate that when you do pick a solution, you need to also, if you can, take a look at what the problem is likely to be. So if you were going to fix that window, that black tape, it would be better than nothing, but it wouldn't go as far as if you used white tape or another color. So it's important to think about that. Tempera paint is non-toxic, widely available and cheap. That's not a solution for everybody, but if you've got kids or a teacher or a nature center, it can be a good project. And then you can constantly change those windows. There's another product called an Acopian bird saver, which more generally is referred to as a Zen wind curtain. On the left here, the window on the middle has them up and the windows on the 2 sides do not. It's basically a weighted rope. So you string it along the top and the ropes hang straight down. If you want them to be perfectly straight, you can fasten the bottom as well. These can be made so that they can be opened and closed, or it can be taken down. You can put little hooks up and put them all on a rod and just go outside and take the rod down. So if you've got a cabin you go to 5 weekends of the year, you can put it up when you're not there and make a big difference. Or if you've got it on your house and you don't want them up when you've got company, they can come down. Although I do think they should just stay up. Most people who do window collision solutions actually don't end up noticing that they're there. And I have things at my house that people have been in my house for 3 days before they even saw that something was up. ABC has a product called bird tape. It comes in lines or squares. If you put those up in the appropriate patterns, which should be 2 by 2 spacing, 2 inches, whether it's vertical or horizontal, is the best. And the further you deviate from that, the less effective the product will be. That's going to be back on the market very soon. I actually just I have a box of brand new samples right next to me. So that's coming back. Popular are the 2 things on the left and the right here, which are window decals that are UV. So the products, some of them say to go on the inside. They should always go on the outside. Because if you put something on the outside of the window, it interferes with the reflection. So you're getting rid of both the reflection and the pattern, and the see-through condition, excuse me. If you put it on the inside, sometimes the reflection overwhelms the pattern and makes it less effective. So those, too often they're at the bird stores and they're like $4 each, and people buy 2 and put them on a 20 square foot window. Well, if you put up 2, you're not going to make a big difference. The more you put up, the more effective they're going to be. But it can get a bit expensive if you think about covering a bunch of large windows that way. So we always have the caveat with those of correct spacing. This is a product called Bird Crash Preventers, which is another 3D product. It's essentially fishing line or monofilament that goes out on the outside of the building in front of the window. There are vinyl window films where you can get film that covers your entire window. There is a company called Feather Friendly, which we'll talk about in a second, that has a do-it-yourself version too. So the Feather Friendly is on this building, but you can see lines, all kinds of different patterns, trees, just put some noise up will make a difference. So Feather Friendly has a do-it-yourself version, which leaves these little white dots in rows, and they can do custom things if you ask them. And that's a fairly popular product. There's another one called Kaleidoscape, which is the same product basically as like the ads on a bus are printed on. So if you're sitting on the bus, you can see out, but people can't see in. That generally totally blocks out the window, which is not a solution for everybody. But if you've got a problem with a spot like this one on the right here, which is Cape May Community College, where it was too bright and too hot, putting these up can actually, solve your collision problem and make the space more usable. Netting is something else that is employed in some places too, although not the most attractive option, if you ask me anyway. We get questions often about ultraviolet UV solutions. Many birds can see ultraviolet light, not all of them can. So if you have a problem with birds like mourning doves hitting your windows and you go for something ultraviolet, the mourning doves are going to hit your windows just like they were before because they can't see it. There are a number of new glass products that are ultraviolet. The one on the bottom right and on the left are actually being hit with a special light so that the pattern fluoresces. Normally it looks like the other two and is fairly clear, so that people can't really see this pattern. And for that reason, the glass companies really like it, but this glass is significantly more expensive than anything else. As far as pulling the shades, it depends on what that does to the reflection. So you can see both of these images on the top, the shades are down on one side and it's still, really reflective. It's a little bit less reflective than the other side, but in some cases, depending on what your shades look like, you can actually create a more uniform reflection than you would have had otherwise and essentially make it worse. The picture on the bottom shows how you should always leave your blinds if you've got this type of blind. They should never be, if you've got the Venetian blind that you can turn, it should never be all the way closed or all the way shut. Always leave them pitched so that they have that opening, which creates that line pattern on your window. Again, you can still see a reflection of a tree there, and that reflection is strong enough that a bird will hit that window. But you are making your windows more visible and reducing the likelihood by leaving your blinds that way. I'm going to introduce you now real quickly to our brand new website, which we have tried to design to answer every single possible collisions question. We've got a bunch more features we're going to be adding to it. So that is coming down the road. And I would also invite you to become an ABC member if you are not. So now just real quickly run through the website. Oops. So we've got the main page here is intended to have a pathway for you no matter why you are here for collisions. So we've got a database of products that you can use to prevent collisions. We've got guides on how to prevent bird window collisions. So if you're focusing on buildings that are already built, if you're an architect or a planner, or you're looking to do legislation, code, and ordinances, we've got a big description about why birds hit glass, along with a link to our, I think it's 77-page PDF, which goes into a lot of depth on that, which is in the downloadable resources, that PDF, along with a bunch of other things. We've got a gallery of bird-friendly buildings. This is the Statue of Liberty Museum in New York City, and that is actually bird-friendly glass, because we want to illustrate to people that these are interesting buildings to look at, and you can actually see out the windows. We have a whole section of resources for the New York City legislation, because that bill actually specifically mentions the ABC tunnel rating system, and everything has to have an ABC threat factor. A frequently asked questions section, a whole section about how we do our research and our testing, Obviously, donate to stop collisions. And then ABC's blog posts. And now that the website is done, this took us a long time. We will start doing blog posts more frequently as come up in the news. So one thing, I'm going to go look in more depth at two things quickly, and then I will stop flapping my gums. The first is that we have a brand new model ordinance. We wrote full definitions that you can just take. So we have a model ordinance crafted around doing what I call 100, 100, 100. 100% of the buildings to 100 feet high on 100% of the glass. Now, if anybody did that, that would be the toughest, strictest legislation anywhere. So we freely and fully admit on the next page here that we don't expect people to actually do that level. So we then kind of walk you through how you can soften it and what your different changes to the language will end up meaning. But we do give you a downloadable Word document that has all of the appropriate definitions. So you don't have to figure out, well, what should we call sufficient for bird-friendly glass? And that is something we will keep updated. This is that guide for kind of how to walk it back and what the changes to your language will mean. We've got every existing piece of legislation, ordinance, and code here ranked and summarized with a direct link to each of the ordinance's text, so that you don't have to go through 1,000 pages of city code to find each one of them. And then a guide on how to kind of promote and advocate for legislation in your community, a little bit about LEED's bird-friendly building credit, and a few other things. And the last thing I will quickly do, this will be very quick, is look at the products that prevent collisions. So this is a database, and there is a bit of a bug in the database at the moment. So if you start with the questions up here and ask if you're a professional or a homeowner, most people here I think would probably fall into this category. It knocks it down to 35 products. So then you can see here, and they're sorted by our threat factors. So the lower this number, the more effective it will be. And you can see insect screen on the outside is number one here. And you can actually get insect screens and solar screens that come with suction cups. So you don't have to change anything about your window. You just buy the screen and suction cup it up there. So you can go through all of these, and all the products I mentioned and then some are all listed here. And as we learn about and test more, they will constantly be added to this. The kind of bug on it is if you go a couple levels down and you're sorting, and more things will open up if I keep picking, this doesn't fully reset when you go back. So you have to actually go back and start over by opening it back up. And with that, I will stop sharing, and we'll see if we have any questions.
Thank you very much. That's wonderful information. And I did share the website in the chat. I will also send an email after the program with some of the links that we've talked about this evening. To be honest, Bryan, you answered most of the questions. The only question that didn't really get answered is, are there screen companies that are on board with making windows bird friendly? And you mentioned the screens that can be purchased to put on top of the window, but how about screen companies or even window companies?
So the screen companies, actually, a lot of the ones with the suction cups don't know anything about collisions or birds. We just added solar screens because I went and looked and found one that would get suction cup up, and I actually need to send them an email and say, hey, there's going to be bird people calling you. So a lot of this stuff is unintentional, but it works. As far as like the screens that are built into your home windows, I spent a number of years as I went through college as a house painter. Most of them, on an older home, they just go on the outside and it either stays up or you take it down in winter. But when you've got the newer kind of sashes that are up and down, and you can move the screen down and drop the storm window down, those screens tend to be half window screens. And when they're up, they tend to be on the inside, right? So if you put it up in winter to put your other one down, it puts it behind a piece of glass. You can actually unscrew those screens, take the whole unit down, and swap the order of those. So your screen is always on the outside, even when your storm window's down. Which, you know, it's not 100% of your window, but it's 50%, and everything makes a difference because, you know, as you're a bird approaching that window, it makes it less of an appealing place to fly because it makes it tighter. As far as brand new windows and the companies that make home windows and screens, no, so far you can't really order this and kind of stuff unless you're doing a special order. I do have that on my to-do list, and we have had conversations with a couple of them. Because even if it's just as simple as like put the screens back on the outside, people, that's, you know, it doesn't cost anybody money to do it. So I hope to get there. But, you know, right now we say if you're building a new home or you're replacing your windows, the best thing to do is buy the windows you want and then apply one of these retrofit products, especially across from a bird feeder or a bird bath.
Yeah, we replaced our windows on our home several years ago. And to be honest, the window salespeople thought I was crazy, that I didn't want the invisible windows for the house. And I was very honest that I have a lot of bird window strikes on this house and I want a screen that goes over the entire window. And we were able to get that, and it made a huge difference. So thank you for that information. I'm going to go ahead and close things up since we are over time. Just real quick, this series, Conservation in Colorado this year, has focused on the 3 billion birds actions, which each of these sessions has been focused on one or a couple of these topics. They are all available except for pesticides, which is our next talk and isn't up yet. They are all available on our YouTube website so that you can go and look at information on these different topics that help birds. Additionally, we have several programs. You can go to our website to see what they are. If you do want to become a better bird watcher, we have a beginning bird watching class hybrid that will be a combination of online as well as field trips, in-person field trips. And like I said, our next program on conservation is how pesticides affect bird health, and that will be in April. If you're interested in legislation in Colorado specifically, every year our Conservation Committee hosts Getting Green Laws, and that is also occurring. You can choose one of 2 sessions. So a couple of programs for you to be aware of. And as always, please support us. Please support American Bird Conservancy. We will send those links out after the program so that you can connect with all of the organizations that presented here today. And Denver Lights Out, of course, is still working on their web presence for their Lights Out program. And I will be sure to share that out when that is available. Additionally, we mentioned Lights Out. There is a new Lights Out Colorado that's going to be focusing on educating the public on what you can do for lighting. You'll get more, that will be available in April. And if you join our mailing list, you will get that information. I want to thank all of our speakers that were here today. And yeah, I'm open for staying on for a few moments more if anybody has additional questions that we did not get to. But otherwise, I will end the program here. Thanks for joining us.